Okay, well, I intend to talk a little bit about the sort of direction of travel around the benefit system, and then a little bit about some of the most heinous things that have happened over the last 7 or 8 years, and finally try to put some of that into a local Taunton context. People have suggested to me very politely on 1 or 2 occasions that I am overly fond of the sound of my own voice. So I shall try not to go on at extreme length, but if people start falling asleep or walking out, I shall take that as a signal to bring it rapidly to a close. And I thought I'd start with a couple of quotes. One from allegedly said by Mahatma Gandhi, that a civilization is measured by how well it treats its weakest members. And another from a more recent political figure who says, the people I meet in Taunton have more money in their pockets. And that's that powerful intellectual Rebecca Power.
It's so unfair.
It is actually almost to the day, 40 years since, as a young man, with hair on top of my head, I walked into the offices in Lemner Road, Leytonstone, of the Department of Health and Social Security in order to start work there. The Department of Stealth and Total Obscurity, as it was known to its customers. And in those days, what we had there was mainly contributory national insurance-based provision, although, of course, there was supplementary benefit, but the majority of the money we paid out was paid out on the strength of past national insurance contribution records. There was almost no subsidies to low wages, almost no in-work wage supplementation. In those days we had decent wage levels. We had these things called trades unions, which some of you may be old enough to remember. And we had low housing costs, low rents, low rates, so there was little need to supplement people by helping them with their housing costs. And that contributory provision, of course, had popular legitimacy. You were claiming back what you'd paid in. You had insured yourself by your national insurance contributions against the risks of unemployment, retirement, sickness, pregnancy, and so on. So when you became unemployed or sick, you claimed something back. There were, of course, problems with that contributory approach. It tended to have very much a sort of male breadwinner structure. If there was stuff in it for women, it was often as a dependent of the working man. The congenitally disabled people who were never able to work, were always going to be outside the system because they were never going to establish a national insurance contribution record. But certainly, if we look back on that compared to where we are now, there's been significant change and I think worsening. There is a kind of siren song, isn't there, which is always used by the advocate of means testing, and it's very seductive. What we're going to do is we're going to concentrate resources on those most in need. But of course, which sounds great, but of course what you end up with in the long run is a means-tested system. And then people aren't claiming back what they put in. No, they're living on taxpayers' money. And there is this shibboleth that the taxpayer is the person who pays income tax on their wages. In fact, we pay tax on most of the things we buy through VAT. We pay fuel duties, we pay tax on our fags. Tell me about it. But that's one of the ways in which we've legitimised an assault on welfare provision. Because we're able to say, oh, look, those people there, they're living on our money. In fact, we pay more in national insurance contributions when we're working, 12%, than we ever did in the past. It's just the point is that these days you get nothing for it, or almost nothing for it. The one thing that's left that's worth having is the state retirement pension. And if we're going to look forward 20, 30, 40 years down the road, they'll probably get rid of that as well. In this period, in the period I've been working in and around the state benefit system, first of all, we had Thatcherism. No such thing as society, just individual men and women looking after their families and making their own choices. So stuff the poor, stuff the sick, stuff the disabled. Workers, not shirkers. You ought to be rewarding workers, not shirkers. So people who are unemployed or who are sick are shirkers in some way, demonised. These days, heck, you could spend an entire evening watching programmes on Channel 5, and every single one of them would say, look at these poor people, let's point at them, let's do them down, let's all look down our noses at them. Now, this is popular entertainment these days. We no longer support and are concerned for those less fortunate than ourselves. We laugh at those less fortunate than ourselves. And under New Labour, we had, in some ways, a similar rhetoric, talking about welfare reform. I don't think to this audience I need point out that when a neoliberal politician talks about reform, you can normally replace the word reform with the words cuts and or privatisation. So local government reform is abolishing most of the things and most of the jobs in local government. Privatising, reforming the NHS becomes privatising the NHS. And welfare reform is about cutting benefits. More recently, we've had the coalition and the economics and politics of austerity. And now we really have moved from social security to welfare. Let's just focus on some of the key changes. First of all, the sick. Sick people now claim something called employment and support allowance. It's rather confusing because it replaces contributory national insurance-based provision, which used to be called incapacity benefit, and also means-tested provision for people who are sick, what used to be income support for people who are long-term sick. We've seen ever tighter qualification rules imposed in that. There are two groups you can be put into if you can get through the very tough medical. The work-related activity group, you're too ill to be able to work, but you should still engage in some kind of work-related activity. And the support group, the people who are so ill that they're not even expected to engage in work-related activity. The work-related group now receive no extra amount in universal credit or in the current legacy benefits. They used to get an extra 30-odd quid a week compared to an unemployed person, but that's now been abolished. In addition, the work-related group only receive the contributory form of employment support allowance for a year. So you paid your national insurance contributions for 20, 30 years, you become incapable of work, you get through the very tough medical, you're put, unfortunately for you, in the less disabled work-related activity group, and that only lasts for a year. Whereas in the past, you'd have been put onto incapacity benefit, and provided you continued to provide medical evidence and so on, that would have carried through until state pension age. It's a dramatic cut in entitlement. We're talking about insuring ourselves against long-term ill health. This is a very dodgy insurance company to do business with. We're not just after the sick, we're also after the disabled. Working age disabled people are having the benefit that they did receive in the past, disability living allowance, or DLA, replaced by a new benefit called personal independence payment, or PIP. It is widely known as PIP because it's intended to give a lot of disabled people the PIP. And that is designed to save 20% of the expenditure on working age disability benefits. So like with the SA, there's this rather complicated assessment process where your activities, your ability to undertake activities is measured against a series of descriptors. And if you can't do the thing at all, you score a lot of points. If you have no problem with it, you score no points. And in between, you score so many points, it's all totted up at the end and so on. Actually, so far, it's ended up costing more. So you go through the process of trying to cut everybody's benefits, and you're so blitheringly incompetent that you actually end up, in the short term at least, spending more. Part of the reason for that, of course, is because the DWP, as she now is, the Department of Work and Pensions, or the Department of Whips and Punishments, as it's known to its friends, outsources most of this work to a bunch of blitheringly incompetent outsourcing sharks. Whether they be called Capita. Sorry, I'm sorry, Liz, I said the C word at one of these meetings. I've washed my mouth that. Or Maximus, who are the people currently tasked with doing ESA, or, Lord forbid, Atos, who were doing ESA but were so bad at it that they had to jump out of the contract before they were kicked, but they have got a job doing half the PIP assessments. Atos, so-called, one believes, because they couldn't give a toss about sick or disabled people. One of the things that does, just picking something out as an example, is that you used to get help with DLA if you had mobility problems. Yeah. And your mobility problems were measured by your walking ability. Under PIP, it's not, the mobility component is not paid to people who have walking problems, it's paid to people who have problems mobilising. Well, that sounds, it's the same thing. Actually, it's not. Because if you can mobilise from your armchair into your manual wheelchair and then push yourself a certain distance, you can't score any points because you are mobile. It's almost Kafkaesque, the way in which some of these restrictions have been imposed.
Do you know how many people lost their cars because of that?
Well, certainly that figure is I think in the hundreds of thousands so far, but the process of transferring people of working age from DLA onto PIP is still in process and will be, because of the total failure of implementation of the DWP, whatever it touches, will be in place for many years to come. So, the long run numbers affected there were 3.5 million people of working age in receipt of DLA. Quite a significant proportion of those people were receiving that higher mobility component. Yeah. So it will be the losers will be in the hundreds of thousands. You want to be a little bit wary of this, because whenever some a rather sneering suit stands up and discusses this on primetime television, they say with a perfectly straight face, whenever we bring in a change like this, there's always going to be some winners and some losers. And actually, he's not lying. It's true. There are a few people who are better off under PIP than they are under DLA. Obviously, there are millions who are worse off, but there are a few people, certain categories of people, who might actually be better off. So it is true. There are some winners and some losers. The question to ask him, though, is it true that it's planned to spend 20% less on disabled people of working age? Is that the basis on which the tests were set up? So I've done ESA, I've done PIP. We'll talk a little bit about two other things. Benefits is very boring, and I don't want to. Let's talk a little bit about housing costs and housing support. Obviously, this is a function of wider issues in society. We have ever-increasing housing costs, particularly in big cities and so on. We have a soaring, unrestricted private rented sector. We have the long-term loss of direct council provision, and a lot of housing associations, so-called social landlords, operating, to my mind and in my experience, much more like private sector corporations than socially useful organisations. But we've also attempted to manage these problems through housing benefit. So rather than having rent control, we have a form of rent control through the back door, because we restrict the amount of help that people can get with rent through housing benefit. And there's been an ever-tightening series of restrictions of that over the last 7 years or so. The amount that one can actually get is reduced. The size of the property you can get the help with has been reduced. and currently what are called local housing allowance rates, the rates in the private rented sector, have been frozen for the last year and a half. The amount that your non-dependents are assumed to make towards the family income, and which therefore reduce the help you get with your housing benefit, these so-called non-dependent deductions, typically people who have a grown-up working son or daughter, which in these days of generation rent is of course a not unfamiliar family structure. Those have been massively increased over the last 6 or 7 years. We now apply a lower shared accommodation rate. That used to be applied to under 25s. They got a lower rate of housing benefit because they would be sharing with their ex-student mates or whatever. Well, now the age for that is not 25, it's 35. You're subjected, if you're a single person, to that lower limit whilst you're under 35. And aligned with those cuts to local housing allowances, the way housing benefit works in the private rented sector, we've also seen an assault on housing benefit provision to those actually in the social and council rented sector. That is through the mechanism of the bedroom tax. We've cut housing benefit for those people by 14% if they have one excess bedroom and by 25% if they have 2 or more. Of course, a lot of those people are not in a position to move to somewhere with fewer bedrooms anyway. The number of 1 or 2 bedroom council houses compared to the number of 3 or 4 bedrooms is not such that all the people affected by this would move even if they wanted to. For them it's just a cut to their living standards. They're expected, in the worst case, to pay those extra amounts out of the puny incomes they have from their means-tested benefits. And we've also got a looming bogey on the horizon, universal credit. Now, don't panic too much about universal credit, because universal credit is currently largely only exists in the strange and somewhat diseased mind of Ian Duncan Smith, not really actually on the streets of the country. But Taunton was one of the first areas to go full service with universal credit in October 2016, and that process has already happened elsewhere before then, and everywhere should, by the end of this calendar year, everywhere except in Northern Ireland, should be offering that full service of universal credit. Universal credit has 1 or 2 good points about it. One of the things that we do within the existing or legacy benefits, which is absolutely bonkers, is that for people in low-paid work, we say, well, we can't possibly expect your employer to pay you enough to live on each week, so obviously we must raise money from somewhere through taxation or whatever in order to subsidise the low wages that your employer pays and pay your worker working tax credit instead. And then, if that person seeks help with their rent through housing benefit, if they're living in the private rented sector or in the social rented sector, they then have that working tax credit taken into account in the calculation of the means-tested help that they would get with their rent through housing benefit. And tax credits are run by the revenue and are run on an income tax revenue type means-test assessment, and housing benefit is done on a DWP style type means-test assessment. So you're putting people through 2 slightly different means tests, one after the other, in order to end up with the amount of tax credits or the amount of housing benefit they receive. And it's the strength of universal credit that it turns that into one composite calculation. However, the DWP and indeed the British state seems to be totally incapable of bringing these large administrative projects. It fails repeatedly at implementation. Tax credits, the Child Support Agency, they spent billions on the Child Support Agency and they never collected a penny from anybody. They blew up the National Insurance Records computer for a year and a half. During that time, everybody who reached state pension age had to go into a DHS or DSS office, as she would have been in those days, and say, I've worked here for all of my life. And, all right, in that case you can have a flat rate state pension because we haven't got any national insurance records to work out what you're actually due. And universal credit is heading for being, probably the biggest of those administrative failures. Some people are worse off, some people are better off. don't believe any of this flannel about making work pay. Actually, compared to the existing tax credits regime, if you're looking at people who are not disabled and who don't have children, they're effectively outside universal credit, where they would have been inside working tax credits if they're on a low wage. So there are certainly some people who are sharply worse off. You know, I can do calculations for you and show you, people in that category who might well be 200 quid a month worse off as a result of these changes. But there are also... Yes, if they're working, yes. But there are also other people who are working who will be better off compared to what they would get under the current system. So broadly, it cuts roughly equal. There are some types of people win, some types of people lose. But there are other problems above and beyond that. The focus on monthly payments, the long delay before you get any money through. This is because Duncan Smith thought that poor people should be like the people he knew. They should budget on a monthly basis. They should all get paid monthly, like he and the people he knew was, and then they should budget monthly. So they should get their benefits monthly. It was actually a way of making them work ready, that everything was done on a monthly basis. It doesn't address the fact that this benefit is paid to some people in work, but also to a lot of people out of work, a lot of people who are unemployed or who are sick, to single parents. And for those people, a week-on-week budgeting basis is actually what they live with. It requires a degree of considerable computer literacy. The Taunton CAB report on it goes into some length to somebody who spent several days attempting to complete the online registration process that you have to go through in order to make a claim. The staff are completely inaccessible. You can't go in and see somebody about it. You might get called in, but you can't go in and seek advice. And there is ever greater conditionality. We've had this all the way through about leaning on these people, trying to make them take a low-paid job, trying to make them do as they're told. And at the moment, basically, administrative chaos. A few further points. We've had a benefits freeze. Most means-tested benefit rates are the same in April 2018 as they were in April 2015. All those whinging public sector workers got their 1%. Think of the really poor. They got 0%, and they have done for years. They're even worse off than you are. We have the two-child policy, George Osborne's two-child policy. The Conservatives are very unkeen on allowing the lower orders to breed, and they certainly don't want the benefit system to pay for it. So in working tax credits, in tax credits, and in universal credit, and in the calculation of housing benefit, what you've got a situation where you can only get benefit for the first two children. If your third child is born after April 2017, you don't get anything for them. You might get child benefit at 13 quid a week, but you won't get child tax credits at 50 quid a week. Yeah, in the long run, that is really shafting people. We've been uprating by CPI, not RPI. CPI, which the BBC always used to refer to as the government's preferred measure of inflation, in a slightly sort of offhand tone. They've stopped doing that now. They need the deal on the licence fee. Now it's just referred to as the going rate of inflation. But the beauty of CPI, from the point of view of the DWP, is that it actually is much lower than what you and I would call real inflation. So over the long run, that removes billions out of the benefit system.
Does that not include housing costs in Clive?
No, it doesn't include housing costs, so it doesn't go up as sharply. But after all, the help you're getting with your housing costs has been frozen for several years anyway. A couple of points about Taunton. I've been liaising with my good friends at the Citizens Advice Bureau, and as you'd expect, the thing that they do most of, by a long way, nearly 40% of all inquiries are about problems with benefits. Of those, the single biggest problem area is the personal independence payments. 26% of their benefit inquiries, 14% of their benefit inquiries about employment and support allowance. These are all these people who are being turned down. we've got extraordinary success rates at appeal tribunals. We don't have much in the way of an advice industry these days. I used to work in advice, but nobody does these days. Local authorities don't put any money into funding advice services, and all the legal aid, legal support contracts that were around, legal services contracts which are around, have been removed. There's no legal aid for debt, housing, benefits, and so on anymore now. So what you're left with is the CAB, and they don't provide much in the way of appeal tribunal support. There's all these thousands of people who need help with their appeal tribunals, but they don't have paid representatives doing that sort of stuff. Something I did when I was much younger. But nevertheless, the success rate at those ESA appeal tribunals is running in the region of 65%. And most of those people are unrepresented. If you look at the success rate of people who are represented, it's running at 80-85%. I could get me textbooks out of cold storage and knock off half a dozen in a day and win every one of them, I should imagine, even with one hand tied behind my back. And of course, coming up fast on the rails, the third highest problem area that they deal with is universal credit, as you would expect. There's something else they deal with as well, of course, not so commonly as benefits, and that's debt. That's about 20% of their work. And of course, what is the single most common debt problem of the people of Taunton Deane? It's council tax. Because up until April 2013, we have a national scheme called Council Tax Benefit. Since April 2013, we have had so-called in England, a local council tax reduction scheme. The point about local council tax reduction schemes is that they're nasty to people of working age. You have to run a council tax reduction scheme for pensioners, which is along the lines of council tax benefit as was. But for people of working age, you can do anything nasty you like. Taunton's scheme is not particularly nasty compared to some of the ones in England. But nevertheless, it does say that the most council tax help you can get with your council tax, if you're a person of working age, is 80% of your liability. So if you're supposed to be paying £1,000 a year, the most help you're going to get with that is 800 quid, leaving you 200 quid short. And the single most common cause of problems with debt in Taunton Deane, now and since about 2013-14, is problems with council tax and council tax debt, council tax arrears.
Did you say 80% of council tax or housing benefit?
80% of your council tax liability is the most help you can get as council tax benefit. So if you're liable for £1,000 a year and you're unemployed and on universal credit or job seekers allowance, the most you could get would be 800 quid back. You'd have a 200 quid shortfall. If your council tax liability was 2,000 quid a year, you'd have a 400 quid shortfall. And of course, a lot of the problem with this is that people on very low incomes who were perhaps unemployed in the past, well, when I was unemployed in the past, one of the things that happened was they met my rent and my council tax. They're unemployed now, and they're finding that, no, it doesn't meet your rent because it only meets the eligible amount of rent, which isn't actually what you're paying. Oh, no, it doesn't meet all your council tax. It only meets 80% of your council tax. But people think that they're going to be in that position when they are on benefits, and by the time they wake up and realise that's not how it works, they've built up a debt, which, of course, they're not in a position to repay.
Can I say, is that what Taunton Deane settled on and cried? Because, it was 80%.
Yeah. That is the position at the moment. I don't know if they've made that worse from April 2018. No, I haven't looked at that. But it is a significant factor.
Is that the same for the other districts? Or
all the schemes vary from one local authority to the other. I've seen things which are absolute, compared to Taunton Deane's a model of sanity compared to some of the ones I do. One of the things we do at work is look at every council tax reduction scheme across England. And some of them are absolutely vile. Ones where one of the other things Taunton Deane has is it has a £6,000 capital upper limit. Normally in benefits you have a £6,000 capital lower limit where the first £6,000 is ignored, and a £16,000 upper limit where if you have that much you don't qualify for any help, you can't get any help at all. In Taunton Deane, 6,000 is not the lower limit; it's the upper limit. If you've got £6,000, you cannot get any help. Council tax full stop. But there are others where the upper limit is 1,000. If you have £1,000 in savings, you cannot get any help with your council tax. So but by comparison, Taunton's moderately safe. So I think I've gone on quite long enough. I hope this is okay.
Thank you very much indeed. Would you like to ask any questions? We can have a few minutes perhaps.
Briskly then, yeah.
Anything you didn't ask and went on?
Uncharacteristically short, sharp questions, so not you, Alan.
Really not good. Daniel Blake, at the beginning, it's just a recorded thing, yeah, and all about can you touch your head and that sort of thing. And it was just like my brother, who's always been a Sun reader, a Tory voter, and he had everything wrong with him, a stroke, tumour on his kidney. They tried to give him nothing, and then he read the Mirror and voted Labour. But it's just, Daniel, have you seen Daniel Blake? It's really good, isn't it? Yeah. Not a question, sorry.
Anybody else?
I think you've been quite polite about universal credit. There's what I think people in the Trades Council might like to know is that conditionality is being extended to working people. So now you have people who may be working part-time on a low wage, or maybe they're on a 0 hours contract, who are now under conditionality and can be sanctioned. So to give an example, a woman that I met worked in a rugby club part-time. She was moved over to universal credit, and when she had her first meeting with the work coach, she told her that they had a family holiday booked. And they said, yep, that's no problem. She went on holiday, and during that time, the DWP wrote to her saying that you had to come in for an appointment. Because she didn't come in, they sanctioned her. So she lost the benefit because she'd gone on holiday. And there are stories like this that are starting to appear all over the country of working people who are losing benefit for maybe missed appointments that they knew nothing about, turning up late to meetings, all sorts of things like that that normally only apply to unemployed people, but now applies to working people as well on low incomes. Sorry, that wasn't a question either.
Spot on, spot on.
Yeah, I mean, as usual, on Institute Clive, I learned a thing or two. But so I want to thank you for that. It was an illuminating outline of the problems we're facing. But one thing that we didn't quite onto is that you've outlined the problem. It's just what is the solution to dealing with it? I mean, you talked about how it used to work back in the day. Is it a question of fundamentally reviewing the system and how it operates, or is it simply a question about more money bringing into the system? I mean, there's two countries, but
I'm very much party pre on this. I'm a supporter of what's variously called a citizen's income, a basic income, or a universal basic income. This is an idea which is gaining currency really across the political spectrum. I mean, it's supported by people on the right as well as people on the left. That calls for an unconditional basic income payable to all at the same rate. A basic income paid at a higher rate for pensioners, because the assumption is that pensioners wouldn't be able to work whilst most of the people who receive basic income would, but still paid at a level which would be more or less subsistence. And the arguments in favour of that are it abolishes means testing overnight. If you muck around with tax allowances and things of that sort, you can find a way of affording it, provided it's paid at a sort of subsistence level. So I think it is affordable. And it addresses the problem of automation, because I think there is a genuine fear that as we go 10, 20, 30 years down the line, a huge proportion of jobs are going to be lost. If we fight for and win a decent level of basic income, we gain something from that. If we don't, we may end up in a situation of even greater impoverishment for the poor. So I would argue strongly for that. The Green Party has an excellent scheme on this. Google Green Party CI scheme. I did help write it, so I think it's jolly good. It dates from 2015, but I'm writing another one now, updated to 2018, which should shortly be publicly available. But other models are also available. So the Citizens Income Trust (CIT) have a number of schemes on their website, and other organisations as well have produced such schemes. The Scottish Government is involved in running pilots of a basic income scheme in 3 towns in Scotland. So it's...
The pilot's been run elsewhere as well.
There are pilots running in Finland and in the Netherlands as we speak. So this is an idea which is gaining credibility as an alternative to a contributory system or a social insurance system, which is always going to have problems around the edges about who's included, who's excluded. And also a means-tested system, which has a lot of the problems we've discussed.
Okay.